Throughout history, one of the most common execution methods used was to send a condemned prisoner to the gallows. Inside of cities and towns, there would be a set of gallows found, where local lawmakers carried out the justice on behalf of the king or queen, and people would be paraded up to them in front of large crowds before their execution ordeal began. Hanging was even considered a form of torture, as within the execution method of hanging, drawing and quartering, a prisoner would be cut down from the gallows once they were just taking their last gasps of air, to allow the much more savage, brutal beheading and quartering to then occur. There was different innovations inside of different lands when it came to the gallows, and executioners tested and trialled new methods of execution using the rope. In England, one of these which was developed was the long drop, and this method was used even during the Second World War upon Nazi war criminals, as the men who used this method were very skilled at working out the drop required to snap someone's neck. It was quite straightforward in its use, but prolific executioners such as Albert Pierpoint became infamous for their use of it. Welcome to the Fortress. Join us today as we look at the long drop, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It was in the year 1872 that William Marwood, a British executioner, developed the long drop method. Marwood was an executioner from Lincolnshire, and he persuaded the governor of Lincoln Castle Jail to allow him to carry out an execution using a new method of hanging that he had developed. It was at Lincoln where this method was used. The long drop utilised mathematical and scientific calculations based on the height and weight of a prisoner to calculate the force then required to snap the neck of a prisoner. The specific measurement that the executioners were interested in was the height of the drop for the condemned based on their height and weight. In Ireland this had been used by doctors and was in use decades before it came across to England, and there were executioners in different countries such as America who were using long drops with regards to their executions, but still the short drop was preferred overall. The issues with the short drop was that someone usually died from strangulation after a degree of suffering, as the drop was not sufficient enough to snap the neck of the condemned. Marwood's calculations using the long drop were aimed to ensure that the neck of the prisoner was instantly broken at the end of the drop, and that a prisoner died from asphyxiation whilst they were unconscious, and this was considered much more humane than seeing someone strangled to death following the short drop. The aim for the long drop was to ensure that prison governors and staff also carrying out the executions were not too distressed seeing someone strangle for significant periods of time. The first person to be hanged by Marwood using the long drop was William Frederick Horry, upon the walls of Lincoln Castle's jail. Today Horry is buried inside of the castle's old keep building and structure, and his gravestone is still visible, with the letters WFH and the date of his execution, April 1st, 1872. The execution of Horry went by without any issues and complications, and with this news about the long drop method spread across England, and some executioners were desperate to trial this. With the long drop, the distance was pre-calculated based on the height and weight that a prisoner would fall through the gallows structure or trapdoor. If the rope was positioned right under the left angle of the jaw, it would rotate the head backwards, and the momentum of the drop then breaks the neck and specifically ruptures the spinal cord of the victim, and this then causes a deep sense of unconsciousness, then death straight after. One part of equipment which was important was the use of a brass eyelet in the noose, which broke the neck with greater accuracy. It was calculated that the death part of the hanging actually takes milliseconds for the victim, and that this depends on the length of the drop that the prisoner is given. By skilled executioners working out the required drop based on height and weight, this then removed a lot of suffering for the prisoners. For centuries across England on structures such as the Tyburn Tree, people were led up to the gallows, forced to stand on a stool, or they had the noose tied around their necks on the scaffold. If they were lucky, an executioner kicked out the stool from underneath them, and they were left strangling, but if not, then the executioner just pulled down on the rope as hard as he could, forcing them into the air, strangling the life out of them. This was very different with the long drop, and it brought an end to this. The specific calculations regarding the length of the drop did slightly change over time. In the 19th century, it was usually a drop of between 4 and 10 feet, given based on height and weight, and specifically the weight taken was of the prisoner wearing clothes, as they would for their execution. It was worked out that a final force of roughly 1,260 foot-pounds of force, when combined with the position of the noose, was what caused the fatal dislocation of the neck, and that the break was usually to the second, third, or fourth cervical vertebrae. A shorter drop was used later throughout the years 1892 to 1913, as there was a fear that the sheer amount of force generated could take someone's head clean off, and this is what happened on the gallows before. The drop was incorrectly calculated for some prisoners, resulting in decapitation as the rope went tight. For example, Blackjack Tom Ketchum, the infamous American outlaw, was subjected to a botched execution, as the executioner used a rope that was too long. The effect of this was that his head came straight off, as the rope went taut and stiff, and his head even rolled away to one side. His head then had to be sewn back on for his body to be viewed. There were some accounts of longer drops being used, but the executioners certainly did not want a bloody scene like during the execution of Black Jack, and there was a call at the time for more humane executions, and later in the 20th century, the abolition of capital punishment would come. The British Home Office stepped in at one point and restricted all drops to be between 5 feet and 8 feet 6, as this was found, based on evidence, to be roughly what was needed to carry out the long drop with success. One of the most skilled executioners with this method was Albert Pierpoint, who at the end of the Second World War was drafted in to deal with a number of condemned Nazi war criminals. There was at the time a propensity within the British Army to inject chloroform into the heart of a prisoner at the end of the execution, as the heart could continue to beat 25 minutes after the execution. But Pierpoint decided not to do this, and instead he believed his work with the long drop was enough. Pierpoint on the 8th of March 1946 hanged 8 men inside of Hamlin Prison, and the doctor shortly after the drop listened to the hearts, and for roughly 15 minutes a heartbeat was detected. But the men had the rope taken off following this, and one of the condemned men even began to breathe again. After the execution, a victim would usually sustain bruising and rope marks around their necks, and in some cases they would wet themselves or soil themselves due to the muscles being deprived of oxygen. Total death usually resulted within 30 minutes of someone plunging through the trapdoor, and following the person being sent through this, in Britain they were usually left hanging for an hour. The long drop was a more reliable and quicker method of executing someone in Britain when compared with the standard or short drop, and in centuries before people were strangled and they literally had the lives choked out of them by an executioner. The point of the long drop was to make executions more clinical and successful, and it made botches less likely to happen, but also lowered the burden of responsibility slightly on the executioner, who was using scientific calculations to bring someone's end quicker. The days of strangling a condemned prisoner to death had gone, and the long drop remained in use inside of British prisons right up until the abolition of the death penalty in Britain. It was with this method that the final woman hanged, Ruth Ellis, was condemned, and it was said on her autopsy that her neck had been snapped and her larynx fractured, and that she died from a dislocation of the spine at C2, and this was the intention for her executioner, Pierpoint. But the long drop was a more efficient way of executing, but if it did go wrong, it was harrowing and had terrifying consequences. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.